the moment he wakes up. It didn't begin with a scream. It didn't begin with betrayal. It didn't even begin with a fight. It began with silence. The kind of silence that creeps in after you realize something you can't unrealize. Daniel was sitting alone in his apartment in downtown Chicago when the truth finally reached him. The skyline outside his window shimmered with late-night lights. Sirens echoed in the distance. Somewhere below, a couple laughed as they walked past the building. Life moved forward, but inside him something stopped. If you've ever loved someone who slowly made you question your own sanity, you know the moment I'm talking about. It doesn't explode. It settles. It's quiet. It's heavy. It feels like a stone being placed carefully in your chest. And for months, maybe longer. Daniel had been replaying conversations in his head like security footage from a crime scene. Did I overreact? Was she just stressed? Am I being too sensitive? Why does every argument somehow become my fault? He wasn't a dramatic man. He wasn't insecure. He wasn't controlling. He was steady, thoughtful. The kind of guy friends called when they needed advice. The kind of son parents trusted. The kind of partner who showed up. That's exactly why Elena chose him. But Daniel didn't know that yet. The realization didn't hit him all at once. It crept in slowly, like dawn pushing back darkness. He remembered the early days, the rooftop event near Millennium Park where they first met. She had been magnetic, effortlessly charming, sharp, funny, attentive in a way that made him feel seen. She mirrored him, and if he talked about discipline, she admired it. If he spoke about loyalty, she valued it. If he described his dreams, she encouraged them. It felt aligned. It felt rare. And that's what made what came later so confusing. Because admiration gradually shifted into expectation. Expectation turned into subtle criticism. Criticism turned into emotional tests. At first, it was small. Why didn't you text back sooner? Are you sure your friend respects our relationship? I just feel like you don't prioritize me the way I prioritize you. Nothing explosive. Nothing obviously abusive. Just enough doubt to make a good man question himself. And good men do question themselves. Daniel believed in accountability, so when she seemed hurt, he apologized, even when he wasn't sure what he had done wrong. When she withdrew, he worked harder. Even when she accused him of being distant, he gave more. He told himself relationships require patience. He told himself strong men don't run. He told himself love means effort. What he didn't realize was that he had slowly stepped into a role he never auditioned for. He was no longer her partner. He was her regulator, her emotional stabilizer, her reassurance source, her constant. And she depended on that more than she would ever admit. The night everything changed, there was no dramatic confrontation, no cheating scandal, no public humiliation. There was simply a pattern. He remembered an argument from weeks earlier. She had accused him of embarrassing her at a dinner with friends in Lincoln Park. He had barely spoken during the evening, but somehow by the end of the night, he had been apologizing for being insensitive. He remembered how she praised him the following morning, called him supportive, told him he was the only man who truly understood her. Then 3 days later, she went cold again. Praise, devaluation, withdrawal, reconciliation, the cycle was precise. And suddenly, it wasn't emotional chaos, it was structure. That's when the silence in his apartment became heavy. It wasn't that she didn't love him the way he loved her. It was that she needed him the way someone needs oxygen, not as a partner, but as a supply. And that realization is what a narcissistic woman fears most. Not losing him, not the breakup, not even the possibility that he might move on. She fears the moment he sees, because confusion is control. As long as he doubts himself, she remains powerful. And as long as he questions his memory, she shapes the narrative. But once he connects the dots, once he sees the pattern, the illusion fractures. and illusions are fragile. Elena didn't fall in love with Daniel's kindness. She relied on it. There's a difference. Narcissistic women are often drawn to emotionally stable men because stability is something they cannot generate internally. Good men are safe anchors. They listen. They adjust. They give the benefit of the doubt. They try harder when things feel off. And that trying harder is precisely what keeps the cycle alive. When Daniel began to understand this, something unexpected happened. He didn't feel rage, he didn't feel hatred, he felt clarity. And clarity is far more dangerous than anger. Anger still reacts, clarity withdraws. That night, sitting in that quiet Chicago apartment, Daniel realized something that shook him more than any argument ever had. She never feared losing me. She feared losing control of how I see her. That shift is seismic. Because once a man understands the game, he stops playing. He stops defending himself against accusations that don't make sense. He stops apologizing for feelings he didn't create. He stops shrinking to preserve peace. And when he stops shrinking, she feels it. If you're watching this and something inside you feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You were not weak. You were generous. You were not naive. You were trusting. And those are not flaws. They become painful only when offered to someone who feeds on emotional validation without reciprocating it. Now here's the truth that might shock you. Even when a narcissistic woman realizes she has hurt a good man, truly hurt him, her greatest fear is not his pain. It's his awakening. Because once he wakes up, she loses the version of him she could manipulate. She loses the man who explained himself endlessly. She loses the man who chased reassurance. She loses the man who believed her tears meant accountability. And she knows something most people don't. A good man who finally sees the truth does not forget it. He may forgive, he may reflect, but he will never return to blindness. And that is terrifying for someone who depends on control to feel secure. This is just the beginning of Daniel's story. In the next parts, we're going to unpack what happens when he stops reacting, when he stops supplying emotional fuel, and when he begins rebuilding a life that no longer revolves around her moods. But before we go deeper, if this resonates even slightly with your experience, subscribe to this channel. Not because of algorithms, but because stories like this matter. Too many men suffer silently in relationships that erode their confidence slowly, invisibly. If this conversation gives you clarity, perspective, or even one moment of validation, your subscription helps this message reach someone else who might be sitting alone in their own quiet apartment tonight, wondering if they're the problem. Now let me ask you something, be honest. When you started noticing something was wrong in your relationship, what did you do first? A. You blamed yourself and tried harder. B. You sensed the pattern but stayed quiet to keep the peace. Comment A or B below. Your answer says more about your strength than you realize, and in the next part, I will talk about what she feels when that strength stops feeding her control. The fear of losing emotional supply. What a narcissistic woman fears most after a good man wakes up is not confrontation. It is depletion, not his anger, not his accusations, but the quiet, steady withdrawal of something she depended on more than she ever admitted. Daniel didn't announce his shift. He didn't make a speech. He didn't slam a door. He simply stopped feeding a system that had been quietly draining him for years. At first, the change was almost invisible. He stopped sending the long, reassuring messages after every disagreement. He stopped explaining himself in paragraphs. He stopped analyzing her moods like a meteorologist predicting emotional storms. When Elena felt insecure, she was used to his immediate comfort. When she felt slighted, she expected his quick apology. When she was jealous, she anticipated his reassurance. And Daniel had delivered every time. Not because he was weak, because he cared. He believed that love meant showing up emotionally. He believed in being steady. He believed in fixing what could be fixed. What he didn't realize was that he had become her emotional infrastructure. Some people depend on money. Some depend on status. Elena depended on Daniel's emotional regulation. When she felt empty, he filled the silence. When she felt anxious, he grounded her. When she doubted herself, he reminded her of her brilliance. But the exchange was never equal. When Daniel had a hard day at work, she redirected the focus. When he felt overwhelmed, she reframed it as him being distant. When he needed support, when the conversation somehow circled back to her feelings. He thought this was imbalance. It was dependence. There's a difference between loving someone and using someone to stabilize yourself. When Daniel began conserving his energy, something subtle but profound happened. He stopped responding immediately. He waited before answering emotionally charged messages. He didn't rush to correct misunderstandings that weren't his responsibility. He chose silence over self-defense. And that's when the fear began. Not visible fear, not trembling panic, but control anxiety. You have to understand something crucial. For someone who depends on emotional supply, energy equals security, attention equals safety, reassurance equals identity. When that supply begins to thin out, it doesn't feel like loss of affection. It feels like existential threat. At first, Elena interpreted his calmness as temporary distance. She told herself he was stressed. She convinced herself he would return to normal. But Daniel didn't return. He became measured. He responded without over-explaining. He disagreed without apologizing. He stopped volunteering emotional labor. And that is terrifying for someone who relied on predictable emotional access. When a narcissistic woman senses her supply weakening, she doesn't respond with humility. She escalates. But escalation doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like vulnerability. Elena began sending nostalgic messages. Remember when we stayed up talking until 3 a.m.? Remember how you said I was the only woman who understood you? She used shared memories like anchors, trying to pull him back into emotional familiarity. And when nostalgia didn't trigger the old reassurance cycle, she shifted again. She became distant, cool, strategically unavailable, silence designed to provoke reaction, because reaction proves relevance. If he chases, she matters. If he argues, she still has influence. But Daniel didn't chase. He didn't accuse. He didn't panic. He simply continued living. That calm is what unravels the dynamic. Because when emotional supply dries up, the emptiness underneath resurfaces. And emptiness is something Elena had avoided her entire life. Many narcissistic patterns develop as protection against deep-seated insecurity. Beneath the charm, beneath the superiority, beneath the confidence is often a fragile internal structure that cannot self-soothe. Daniel had unknowingly become her regulator. Without him, she had to sit alone with her own anxiety. Without his reassurance, she had to manage her own self-doubt. Without his immediate responses, she had to tolerate uncertainty. And uncertainty is unbearable when control has always been your coping mechanism. This is where many good men make a mistake. They interpret her escalation as proof that she cares deeply. But panic does not equal love. It equals dependence. There's a significant difference. Love respects autonomy. Dependence resists it. When Daniel began focusing on himself, spending more time at the gym, reconnecting with friends, taking solo weekend trips, Elena noticed something she couldn't control. He wasn't shrinking anymore. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't orienting his life around her reactions. And something about that independence felt threatening. Because independence signals replacement, and not replacement by another woman. Replacement by self-sufficiency. A narcissistic woman fears self-sufficiency more than she fears competition. Competition can be fought. Self-sufficiency cannot be manipulated. Daniel's energy had been predictable. She could provoke reassurance. She could trigger explanation. She could initiate conflict and anticipate resolution. But when his responses became steady and minimal, the old script stopped working. That's when subtle tactics intensified. She began posting curated photos online, dinners with new acquaintances, ambiguous captions about growth and new beginnings. She wasn't necessarily trying to move on. She was testing impact. Would he react? Would he reach out? Would he ask who she was with? But he didn't. And when he didn't, she experienced something unfamiliar, irrelevance. And there is no greater threat to someone who builds identity around external validation than irrelevance. Attention fuels narrative. Without attention, narrative collapses. Daniel's withdrawal wasn't dramatic. It was disciplined. He stopped feeding discussions that circled nowhere. He stopped offering emotional reassurance when none had been reciprocated. He stopped absorbing blame that didn't belong to him. And most importantly, he stopped measuring his worth by her approval. When that shift occurs, something fundamental breaks. She realizes she cannot easily replace what she had. Charm is common. Consistency is rare. Emotional generosity without manipulation is rare. Stability without ego is rare. And while she might believe she can find another man to fill the space, she also understands something uncomfortable. In good men who truly wake up rarely return to emotional dependency. They may forgive, they may heal, but they do not volunteer to be drained again. That's the quiet terror underneath her reactions. Not that she will be alone, but that she lost access to someone irreplaceable. And the loss wasn't because he attacked. It wasn't because he exposed her. It wasn't because he retaliated. It was because he conserved his energy. Energy conservation is revolutionary in toxic dynamics. When you stop pouring into someone who has grown accustomed to it, the imbalance becomes visible. And once visible, it cannot be unseen. Daniel didn't change into someone cold. He changed into someone aware. He redirected his attention toward growth. He invested in his health. He deepened friendships. He allowed silence to exist without filling it with apology. And slowly, the emotional infrastructure she relied on disappeared. This stage is deeply uncomfortable for both sides. For the good man, there is grief. Not just grief for the relationship, grief for the illusion. For the future he imagined. For the version of her he hoped was real. For the effort he poured in believing it would stabilize something unstable. But grief is cleansing, because it clears space for reality. For her, however, the discomfort is different. It's destabilization. The person who absorbed her anxiety is no longer available. The person who validated her superiority is no longer volunteering. The person who softened every insecurity is no longer rushing to soothe. And that leaves her alone with herself. This is why the fear of losing emotional supply runs so deep. It exposes internal emptiness, and it forces self-regulation. It removes external mirrors. Without Daniel's steady admiration, she must confront her own fluctuations. And that confrontation is frightening. If you are in this stage, understand something powerful. Your calm withdrawal is not cruelty, it is recalibration. You are not punishing her. You are protecting yourself. You are not withholding affection, you are withholding self-abandonment. And that distinction changes everything. The fear she experiences is not evidence that you were wrong to leave. It is evidence that your presence mattered. But presence without reciprocity is unsustainable. Daniel eventually understood this. He realized that love cannot survive on one-sided emotional labor. He realized that reassurance cannot replace accountability. That he realized that stability cannot fix someone who refuses introspection. And as his emotional supply faded, something new began forming inside him. self-respect. Not loud, not aggressive, quiet, grounded, unshakable. That is what a narcissistic woman fears when she has hurt a good man. Not his revenge, not his anger, but his independence. Because once he learns to regulate himself without needing to rescue her, once he learns to conserve his energy instead of offering it freely to someone who drains it, the dynamic is over. And when the dynamic is over, her control ends. And that is far more frightening than losing him. It is losing the supply she built her sense of security around. And without it, she must finally face herself. The fear of his calm detachment. There is a moment in every collapsing dynamic that feels almost unnatural. And it is not loud, it is not dramatic, it does not announce itself with slammed doors or explosive arguments. It is stillness, and for someone like Elena, that stillness is unbearable. Daniel did not become cruel, he did not become cold, he became calm. And that calmness was more destabilizing than any confrontation could ever be. Months after his awakening in Chicago, Daniel found himself sitting across from Elena at a cafe in Santa Monica. The ocean breeze carried through the open doors. Sunlight reflected off polished glass tables. Around them, strangers laughed, couples talked. Life unfolded with ordinary ease. But at their table, tension lingered. Elena arrived prepared with grievances, prepared with emotional ammunition, prepared with carefully chosen phrases designed to pull him back into the familiar pattern. "You've changed," she said softly at first, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "You used to fight for us." That sentence in the past would have pierced him. He would have defended himself, he would have explained, he would have rushed to prove his commitment. But Daniel did something different. He breathed. "I'm focusing on my well-being," he replied evenly. No edge in his voice, no accusation, no apology, just truth. There is something profoundly unsettling about a man who does not react the way you expect him to. For years, Elena had known exactly how to move him. A raised eyebrow could trigger reassurance. A sigh could initiate apology. A tear could reverse an argument. She knew which stories to bring up. She knew which insecurities to touch. She knew how to tilt the emotional atmosphere just enough to make him chase clarity. And that chase had been her leverage. But now she couldn't find traction. Calm detachment is not silence. It is not passive aggression. It is not emotional shutdown. It is presence without participation. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend every mischaracterization. He didn't try to correct her narrative. He simply allowed her words to exist without absorbing them. For someone accustomed to emotional reactions, this is disorienting. Because reaction confirms influence. When you provoke someone and they flare up, you know you still matter. When you accuse and they defend, you know you still have power. When you cry and they rush in, you know the tether remains intact. But when you provoke and receive steadiness, the tether weakens. Elena felt it in her chest before she could articulate it. Something was slipping. Her voice grew sharper. "You act like none of this affects you." He met her gaze. "It does," he said calmly. "I just don't want to keep repeating the same cycle." There it was. He named the pattern without attacking her. That is what frightened her most. He wasn't blaming. He wasn't shaming. He wasn't escalating. He was stepping out. There is a psychological phenomenon known as an extinction burst. When a behavior that once produced a result suddenly stops being reinforced, it temporarily intensifies before fading. Elena's tactics intensified, her tone hardened. She referenced old sacrifices. She brought up moments when she had been vulnerable. She accused him of emotional abandonment. The volume rose, the accusations sharpened. In the past, this would have overwhelmed him. He would have scrambled to restore equilibrium. But Daniel understood something new. He did not need to regulate her emotions anymore. He did not need to prove his goodness in every argument. He did not need to correct every distortion. He could let her discomfort belong to her. That shift was monumental, and she felt it, because control thrives on emotional entanglement. Calm detachment dissolves entanglement. There is a misconception that detachment is coldness. It isn't. Coldness is retaliatory. Detachment is protective. Daniel was not punishing Elena. He was protecting himself. There is a difference. When you detach calmly, you remove the emotional spikes that keep the cycle alive. You do not shout. You do not insult. You do not retaliate. You simply refuse to participate, and refusal is powerful. Elena tried a different approach. Her shoulders softened, her voice lowered. I just miss how close we used to be, she said quietly. This was not necessarily manipulation in a conscious, villainous sense. It was instinct. When control through confrontation fails, vulnerability becomes the next strategy. Daniel felt the familiar pull, the urge to comfort, the urge to reassure, the urge to lean forward and say, "Well, we can fix this." But he paused, because he understood something critical. If he rushed to soothe her discomfort, he would reactivate the old dynamic. Instead, he responded honestly. "I miss what I thought we had," he said gently. Not cruel, not defensive, just clear. Clarity is threatening when someone depends on emotional ambiguity. Ambiguity allows reinterpretation. Clarity closes doors. In that moment, Elena recognized something that frightened her more than anger ever had. Yet Daniel was not emotionally available on her terms anymore. And that loss of availability felt like loss of control. When a narcissistic woman senses that she cannot provoke, cannot seduce, cannot guilt someone into returning to old patterns, panic does not always appear dramatic. Sometimes it appears as frustration, sometimes as subtle hostility, sometimes as icy distance. But underneath there is a single fear. He is no longer predictable. Predictability is security for someone who manages relationships through control. Daniel's calm was unpredictable because it wasn't reactive. It wasn't fueled by ego. It wasn't trying to win. It was anchored. He had begun grounding himself in something internal rather than external validation. That internal anchoring made him difficult to manipulate. He was no longer negotiating from insecurity, and he was not asking her to confirm his worth. He was not seeking reassurance. He was not defending his character at every accusation. And when you remove those vulnerabilities, the tactics lose effectiveness. Elena noticed something else, too. His calm did not mean he lacked emotion. He still felt sadness. He still felt disappointment. But he did not weaponize those feelings against her. He owned them. He processed them. He did not hand them to her as tools. That emotional sovereignty was foreign to her. Because in dynamics where control dominates, emotions are currency. Tears buy sympathy. Anger buys compliance. Guilt buys reassurance. But Daniel stopped trading. And when you stop trading in a system built on exchange, the system destabilizes. She left the cafe unsettled, not because he insulted her, not because he exposed her, but because he was no longer accessible in the way she had relied on. Calm detachment creates a mirror, and sometimes what that mirror reflects is uncomfortable. It reflects a person who cannot force reaction. It reflects a person who must sit with their own discomfort. It reflects a loss of influence, and influence for someone accustomed to shaping emotional outcomes feels like identity. When Daniel stopped reacting, Elena felt smaller. Not because he diminished her, but because she could no longer expand through his emotional responses. In the days that followed, she tested the boundaries again. Sharp text messages, ambiguous remarks, references to men who had shown interest. He responded politely, briefly, without curiosity, without jealousy, without defensiveness. And with each non-reaction, something inside her tightened. And because indifference is misread as apathy, but in truth, It is often resolution. Daniel was not indifferent to her humanity. He was indifferent to the manipulation. And that distinction changed everything. He had learned that calm is not weakness. It is control over oneself, and self-control cannot be hijacked easily. This is what a narcissistic woman fears when she has hurt a good man. She fears his steady detachment more than his outrage. Outrage can be redirected. Detachment cannot. Anger keeps connection alive. Calm closure ends it. When a man no longer needs to win the argument, when he no longer needs to prove his innocence, when he no longer seeks validation from the person who destabilized him, the dynamic dissolves, and that dissolution feels like invisibility to someone who built identity around influence. Daniel's calm was not born from apathy. It was born from understanding. He understood that peace is not achieved through louder arguments. It is achieved through refusal to engage in destructive cycles. He understood that protecting his energy was not selfish. It was necessary. He understood that staying calm did not mean he accepted mistreatment. It meant he chose dignity. That dignity was something Elena could not dismantle. And when she realized that her usual tactics no longer moved him, she confronted something deeply unsettling. He was becoming unreachable, not because he hated her, not because he sought revenge, but because he had reclaimed emotional authority. And emotional authority cannot be negotiated away. That is why calm detachment terrifies someone who once depended on your reactions, because it signals the end of leverage, in the end of predictable control, the end of emotional supply. And in its place stands something much stronger: self-possession. Daniel walked away from that meeting not triumphant, not bitter, but grounded. He did not need to defeat her. He needed to free himself, and he did. That freedom expressed quietly through calm detachment was more powerful than any argument he could have won. And for Elena, it was the beginning of something she had always avoided: irrelevance. That is the fear beneath it all. Not that he left, not that he moved on, but that he no longer reacts, because when he stops reacting, she loses access. And when she loses access, she loses control. And that is what she fears most in his calm detachment: the fear of his self-forgiveness. There is a stage in healing that does not look dramatic from the outside, and there are no arguments, no confrontations, no visible battles. It happens quietly, in rooms where no one is watching. It happens in journals, in long walks, in early morning workouts when the air is cold and your thoughts are louder than the world. And this is the stage a narcissistic woman fears more than she fears exposure. She fears his self-forgiveness, because when a good man stops blaming himself, she loses the final thread that connects him to her. Daniel did not wake up one day suddenly whole. He did not flip a switch and feel free. The calm detachment he showed Elena in Santa Monica had come at a cost. Behind that calm had been months of internal interrogation. He questioned his judgment. He replayed early red flags. He asked himself why he had stayed when his instincts had whispered something was wrong. At night, in the quiet of his Chicago apartment, he would lie awake and revisit moments that now looked obvious. The dinner in Lincoln Park where she criticized him in front of friends. The argument that ended with him apologizing for something he hadn't done. The time she accused him of being emotionally unavailable right after he had spent hours comforting her. The pattern had been clear, but clarity after the fact often turns inward. Why didn't I see it sooner? Why did I keep trying? Was I too naive? For many good men, the hardest part is not accepting that someone manipulated them. It is accepting that they allowed it. That self-judgment can be brutal. And Elena understood something about him even if she never articulated it. Daniel's conscience was strong. He believed in responsibility. He believed in accountability. And that belief made him vulnerable to guilt. Guilt had been the invisible rope that tied him to her long after logic suggested he should let go. She didn't need to scream to pull him back. She only needed to imply that he had failed her. And he would step forward voluntarily, trying to repair something he did not break. But something shifted the day Daniel stopped framing the relationship as his failure. It began in a therapist's office, a small room with neutral walls and two chairs angled toward each other. He wasn't dramatic when he walked in. He was composed, measured. He described the relationship calmly. He recounted the cycles. He outlined the arguments. He listed the ways he had tried to fix things. And then the therapist asked a simple question. When did you start believing her emotions were your responsibility? The question lingered. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Because he realized something. He had never consciously agreed to that role. He had stepped into it slowly, incrementally. He had absorbed her discomfort because he believed that was what strong men do. They protect, they stabilize, they endure. But protecting someone from their own internal chaos is not strength. It is self-abandonment. That realization was painful, because it meant confronting not only her manipulation but his own pattern of overfunctioning. He began journaling in the evenings, not to analyze her, but to understand himself. He wrote about his childhood, about being the responsible one, about mediating conflicts between friends, about taking pride in being steady when others were volatile. And that steadiness had served him well in life, but in that relationship, it had been exploited. Self-forgiveness began not with excusing her behavior, but with understanding his own. He wrote a letter to himself one night. Not the version of himself who sat calmly across from Elena in Santa Monica, but the version of himself who stayed during the early red flags. He wrote to the man who apologized unnecessarily, to the man who worked harder when things felt off, to the man who thought love meant endurance. He thanked him. He thanked him for trying. He thanked him for believing in repair. He thanked him for caring deeply, and then he released him. That release was transformative because when a man forgives himself, guilt loses power. And without guilt, there is nothing left to leverage. Elena sensed it before she understood it, so she reached out weeks later, not aggressively, not angrily, just softly. "I've been thinking a lot," she wrote. "I know I wasn't perfect, but we both made mistakes." In the past, that phrasing would have triggered introspection. He would have analyzed his contribution. He would have offered partial blame to keep the conversation balanced. But now, he read the message differently. He saw the symmetry attempt. He saw the subtle invitation to reopen the guilt loop. And he felt something unexpected. Compassion, not for her manipulation, but for her inability to take full accountability. He responded briefly. "I've taken responsibility for my part. I wish you well." No emotional hooks, no invitation to reprocess the past, no reopening of old wounds. That was self-forgiveness in action. He did not need her acknowledgement to validate his experience. He did not need her apology to move forward. He did not need closure from someone who had rarely offered clarity. And that independence frightened her. Because self-forgiveness removes the last emotional doorway. When a good man still feels guilty, he is reachable. When he still wonders if he was too harsh, he is reachable. When he still seeks validation that he did the right thing, he is reachable. But when he forgives himself fully, he stops negotiating his own worth. He stops revisiting the courtroom in his mind. He stops presenting evidence to imaginary juries. He rests. And rest is dangerous to someone who thrived on his inner turmoil. Daniel's healing extended beyond therapy. He relocated temporarily to Austin for a work project. The change of environment helped. New routines, new faces. He joined a gym near his apartment and committed to consistency. Not to prove anything, but to reconnect with his body. Physical discipline became grounding. Each early morning workout was a quiet declaration. I invest in myself. He rebuilt friendships that had faded during the relationship. He apologized to no one for needing space. He volunteered occasionally at a community mentorship program for young men navigating early adulthood. Listening to them talk about ambition, confusion, heartbreak reminded him of his own resilience. Self-forgiveness expanded his identity beyond the man who was hurt. He became the man who learned. That reframing is critical, because victimhood can become an identity if not processed carefully. Daniel refused to let that happen. He did not demonize Elena in every conversation. He did not obsessively analyze her behavior. He focused inward. He asked himself harder questions. Why did I equate endurance with love? Why did I ignore my intuition? What boundaries will I uphold next time? Self-forgiveness is not denial. It is integration. It means acknowledging you were hurt without defining yourself by the hurt. And once that integration solidifies, something shifts permanently. Elena realized it during a mutual friends gathering months later. Daniel was there, relaxed, engaged, laughing naturally, not guarded, not bitter. He was not avoiding her, but he was not seeking her either. When she attempted a private conversation, his tone was kind but neutral. There was no emotional residue, no tension beneath the surface. That absence of residue unsettled her. Because unresolved guilt leaves texture. Unresolved guilt leaves a thread to pull. But there was nothing to pull. He had processed it. He had forgiven himself for staying. He had forgiven himself for believing. He had forgiven himself for loving sincerely. And that forgiveness made him unreachable, not because he was hardened, but because he was whole. For someone who once relied on his self-doubt, that wholeness feels like rejection. It feels like erasure. Because if he no longer questions himself, he no longer seeks reassurance from her. And if he no longer seeks reassurance, she no longer occupies a central place in his emotional world. Self-forgiveness is quiet power. It does not shout, it does not announce, but it closes doors gently and permanently. Daniel's forgiveness did not mean he minimized what happened. He remembered clearly. He understood the patterns. He maintained boundaries. But he did not carry resentment as fuel. Resentment ties you to the past. Forgiveness unties you. That untethering is what she feared, because resentment keeps connection alive. Anger keeps narrative alive. Guilt keeps vulnerability alive. Forgiveness dissolves all three, and in their absence there is space. Space for new identity. Space for new love. Space for self-respect. When Elena realized Daniel no longer blamed himself, she confronted something she had avoided. He was no longer emotionally accessible through remorse. He had forgiven himself, and by doing so, he removed the last emotional doorway she could walk through. That is why a narcissistic woman fears his self-forgiveness more than his anger. Anger can be negotiated. Forgiveness cannot. Anger still signals investment. Forgiveness signals release. And once a good man releases himself from self-blame, he does not return to the version of himself that accepted less than he deserved. Daniel understood now that his kindness was not weakness. His loyalty was not foolishness. His patience was not deficiency. Those qualities simply require discernment, and discernment is born from reflection, not self-punishment. When he looked in the mirror now, he did not see the man who had been manipulated. He saw a man who learned boundaries. A man who strengthened his internal compass. A man who forgave himself for not knowing what he did not yet understand. That forgiveness made him dangerous in the healthiest way possible. Dangerous to old patterns. Dangerous to manipulation, dangerous to guilt. And that is what she feared most. Not that he exposed her, not that he confronted her, but that he no longer carried the emotional weight she once placed on his shoulders. He set it down. And when he did, he stood taller. And when he stood taller, she realized something final. He was free. And freedom cannot be manipulated. The fear of his new life. There is something more unsettling than being left. There is something more painful than being replaced. There is something more destabilizing than being exposed. It is watching someone you once controlled build a life that does not require you. That is what Elena feared most. Not Daniel's anger, not Daniel's silence, not even Daniel's boundaries. She feared his happiness, not the loud, performative kind of happiness meant to provoke jealousy, but the quiet, grounded kind that does not look back. Months after their final conversation in Santa Monica, our Daniel stood on a hiking trail in Colorado. The air was thinner at that altitude, cleaner. There was something about the mountains that stripped away unnecessary noise. The sky felt wider. His breathing felt deeper. He wasn't thinking about Elena. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't crafting a narrative of revenge success. He was simply present. And that presence was new. For a long time, even after the relationship ended, parts of his mind had remained tethered to her reactions. Even in absence, he had imagined how she might interpret his choices. Would she think he moved on too fast? Would she assume he was pretending to be okay? Would she criticize him silently from a distance? That mental tether eventually dissolved, not dramatically, gradually. One morning, he realized he had gone several days without considering what she might think. And that realization felt like oxygen. Freedom is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not post itself on social media. It is internal quiet. Elena saw a photograph weeks later. A mutual acquaintance had shared it. Daniel standing at the edge of a mountain ridge, wind pushing against his jacket, smiling in a way that looked unforced. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to send a message. It was the smile of someone who had integrated pain and moved beyond it, and something shifted inside her. She had expected one of two outcomes. Either he would collapse emotionally and attempt to reconnect, or he would rush into another relationship to fill the void. Both scenarios would have reassured her that she still occupied psychological space in his life. But this third outcome unsettled her. He was neither collapsing nor compensating. He was evolving. There is a profound difference between moving on and moving forward. Moving on can be reactive. Moving forward is intentional. Daniel had moved forward. He invested in his work without obsessively overworking to distract himself. He expanded his social circle in Austin without clinging to anyone as a replacement. He dated casually at first, not to prove desirability, but to relearn what mutual energy felt like. And something else began to happen. He stopped telling his story as a victim. He started telling it as a lesson. When friends asked about the relationship, he did not rage. He did not vilify. He did not recount every injustice. He spoke calmly about incompatibility, about patterns, about growth. That tone signaled something important. He was no longer emotionally entangled, and for Elena that was more threatening than hostility. Hostility would have meant unresolved tension. Unresolved tension means unfinished business, but peace means closure, and closure means irrelevance. A narcissistic woman can tolerate being hated more easily than being forgotten. Hatred keeps connection alive. Indifference erases it. What Elena struggled with most was not jealousy of another woman. It was the realization that Daniel's identity no longer included her influence. He wasn't making decisions in opposition to her. He wasn't constructing a new life to contrast the old one. He was simply building. Career decisions became clearer. He pursued projects that aligned with his values instead of choices that accommodated emotional instability. He reconnected with family in ways he hadn't prioritized before. He spent weekends exploring cities without needing to check in constantly. His nervous system softened. The hypervigilance that had once monitored her moods faded. He laughed more easily. He rested more deeply. And this is what makes a narcissistic woman uneasy after hurting a good man. When he thrives, it challenges the narrative. The narrative that he needed her. The narrative that he was incomplete without her. The narrative that she was central to his emotional stability. Daniel's thriving exposed a different truth. He had always been stable. He had simply overextended that stability towards someone who could not reciprocate. When mutual friends mentioned his growth, Elena felt a sensation she couldn't easily categorize. It wasn't pure jealousy, it wasn't longing, and it was displacement. He no longer orbited her world, and she could not reposition herself in his. She considered reaching out again, not dramatically, not with manipulation, but with a tone of curiosity. "How have you been?" The message stayed unsent, because she sensed something. The dynamic had shifted permanently. He would respond politely, briefly, kindly, but without hunger, without emotional undertow, without invitation. And that absence of invitation is destabilizing to someone accustomed to emotional access. The ultimate fear is not that he builds a better life, it is that he builds it without bitterness. Bitterness would imply unresolved energy. Peace implies completion. Daniel's new life was not glamorous in exaggerated ways. It was disciplined, intentional, aligned. He became selective with his energy. He said no without over-explaining. He invested in people who reciprocated. He noticed red flags earlier in new connections. He listened to his intuition instead of overriding it. These are subtle shifts, but they signal something powerful: integration. When pain integrates into wisdom rather than hardening into resentment, growth accelerates. Elena could not access that growth. She could observe it from afar, but she could not disrupt it. And that powerlessness felt foreign. Control had once been her anchor. Now she faced something uncontrollable: his contentment. Contentment is different from excitement. Excitement fluctuates. Contentment endures. Daniel did not need dramatic highs to feel fulfilled. He valued steadiness now more than intensity. He valued consistency over passion spikes. He valued emotional safety over thrill. In that recalibration meant he was no longer attracted to volatility disguised as chemistry. And that shift closed the door to repetition. A narcissistic woman fears repetition ending, because repetition sustains supply. When Daniel demonstrated through action that he would not return to cycles of instability, she confronted something irreversible. He had changed. Not superficially, not performatively, fundamentally. And fundamental change cannot be negotiated away. There is something deeply humbling about realizing someone you once influenced no longer seeks your validation, no longer fears your withdrawal, no longer responds to your emotional fluctuations. It creates an internal question that is difficult to avoid. If he can thrive without me, who was I in his life? And that question can be destabilizing for someone who builds identity around being central. Daniel's thriving did not diminish Elena's humanity. It simply removed her control. And control had been mistaken for connection. True connection does not collapse when influence fades. Control does. When Daniel eventually entered a new relationship months later, he approached it differently. He moved slowly. He communicated clearly. He set boundaries early. He paid attention to how he felt rather than how he was perceived. He did not seek validation through performance. He showed up as himself. That authenticity was quieter than his previous effortful devotion, but it was stronger. because it did not require self-sacrifice. Elena heard about the new relationship indirectly. There was no public announcement, no dramatic display, just small mentions in shared circles. He seemed happy, steady, not euphoric, grounded. That grounded happiness is what stings most, because it implies sustainability, and sustainability signals permanence. The fear beneath it all is simple. If he is truly fulfilled without me, I no longer matter in his story. And for someone who anchored identity in being indispensable, that realization cuts deeply. Daniel did not aim to erase her. He aimed to rebuild himself. And in doing so, he unintentionally erased the version of himself she could control. That is the final transformation. When a good man stops defining himself by who hurt him and begins defining himself by who he chooses to become, the narrative shifts permanently. He is no longer reacting, he is creating, he is no longer recovering, he is living. And when he lives fully, authentically, peacefully, without referencing the past as a source of identity, he becomes unreachable. Not emotionally unavailable, not guarded, but free. Freedom is not loud. It does not seek acknowledgement. It does not look over its shoulder. It simply moves forward. Elena's greatest fear was never his departure. It was his independence. Not physical independence, emotional independence, the kind that does not require revenge, the kind that does not require explanation, the kind that does not require closure from someone incapable of giving it. Daniel reached that place. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but genuinely. And in reaching it, he removed the final thread that once connected their dynamic. She could no longer provoke him. She could no longer guilt him. She could no longer re-enter through nostalgia. And she could no longer destabilize him with silence. Because he had built something stronger than reaction. He had built self-respect. And self-respect sustains new life. That is what a narcissistic woman fears most after hurting a good man. Not his anger, not his boundaries, not his detachment, but his thriving. Because thriving without her proves something undeniable. He was never dependent, he was generous. And generosity, when paired with wisdom, becomes power. Daniel did not become hardened. He became discerning. He did not become bitter. He became balanced. He did not close his heart. He protected it. And in protecting it, he ensured that the next chapter of his life would not be written by control, but by clarity. That is the ending she could not control. And that is why it is the one she fears most. Daniel's story was never just about a relationship. It was about identity. It was about the slow erosion of self that can happen when love becomes obligation, when empathy turns into self-abandonment, and when loyalty is weaponized against the very person offering it. When Daniel met Elena in Chicago, he did not walk into the relationship insecure or broken. He walked in steady, thoughtful, and sincere. He believed in effort. He believed in communication. He believed that if two people cared enough, they could work through anything. That belief is not weakness. It is integrity. But over time, what began as admiration turned into expectation. What felt like passion turned into unpredictability. What seemed like depth slowly revealed itself as control. The dynamic didn't collapse in a single explosive moment. It deteriorated quietly. He subtly, through emotional reversals, blame shifting, and constant recalibration of responsibility. Daniel adjusted because he cared. He apologized because he wanted peace. He over-explained because he wanted clarity, and without realizing it, he stepped into a role he never consciously chose. The role of emotional stabilizer for someone who could not stabilize herself. The turning point was not dramatic. It was internal. A realization in the quiet of his apartment that the chaos was not random. It was patterned. The confusion was not accidental. It was functional. Once he saw that pattern, the illusion began to crumble. From there, the journey unfolded in layers. First, he withdrew his emotional supply. Not out of cruelty, but out of conservation. He stopped overfunctioning, and he stopped volunteering reassurance for feelings he did not create. He allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it. And when the supply faded, Elena felt it, not as heartbreak, but as destabilization. Then came calm detachment. He no longer reacted predictably, no longer flared up or folded inward. He remained steady in the face of provocation, and that steadiness removed leverage. When someone who once responded intensely now responds with grounded clarity, the dynamic shifts permanently. But the most powerful transformation happened quietly, away from her, in therapy sessions, in journal pages, in early mornings in Austin. Daniel confronted not only her behavior, but his own patterns. He forgave himself for staying, for trying, for believing. That self-forgiveness severed the final emotional tether. Guilt could no longer be used as a hook. And finally, he built a new life, not as retaliation, not as performance, but as alignment. He hiked in Colorado not to be seen, but to breathe. He formed connections not to replace, but to reciprocate. He chose steadiness over intensity, growth over drama, peace over power struggles. In the end, what Elena feared most was not his anger, not his exposure, not even his absence. She feared his independence, because independence means you are no longer needed as a regulator of someone's worth. It means your reactions are no longer currency. It means your presence is optional. Daniel's story is not about defeating someone, it is about reclaiming himself. And that is the deeper lesson here. The most dangerous thing you can do in a manipulative dynamic is not fight harder. It is not argue louder, and it is not expose more aggressively. It is to become internally anchored. When you stop outsourcing your sense of worth, you become difficult to control. When you stop absorbing responsibility for someone else's emotional instability, you become clear. When you forgive yourself for not knowing what you could not see at the time, you become whole. The lesson is not avoid love. The lesson is discernment. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. Notice how you feel after interactions, not just how they make you feel in the moment. If you constantly feel responsible for another adult's emotions, pause. If you are apologizing more than you are being heard, reflect. If you are shrinking to preserve peace, ask yourself why peace requires your disappearance. Healthy love does not require self-erasure. It does not require walking on eggshells, and it does not require endless emotional proof of loyalty. In your life right now, this story might apply to romantic relationships, or it might apply to friendships, family, even workplace dynamics. The principle remains the same. Protect your energy, clarify your boundaries, forgive yourself for past naivety, and build forward instead of backward. Healing does not mean you will never feel pain again. It means pain will no longer define your identity. Daniel did not become colder. He became wiser. He did not stop loving. He loved with awareness. He did not close his heart. He strengthened its gate. And that is what growth looks like. Now let me ask you something important. When you think about your own life right now, which stage are you in? A. You are still trying to fix someone who keeps shifting the blame. B. You have started pulling your energy back and focusing on yourself. Comment A or B below. There is no judgment here, only awareness. And I also want to hear your perspective. What part of Daniel's journey resonated most with you? Was it the awakening, the calm detachment, the self-forgiveness, or the rebuilding? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can read and feel less alone in their own experience. If this story gave you clarity, validation, or even just one moment of insight, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going, and it ensures you won't miss the next deep dive into emotional patterns, healing, and strength. Your growth matters. And the next chapter of your life deserves to be written by you.